Welcome and thank you for listening to the first episode of Tax Break. This is a new podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. I would like to use this first episode to share a bit more information about myself, about the podcast, and where you can find it. So, my name is Pieter van der Schwan. I'm the presenter and the host of this podcast. I live in South Africa in a smallish town called Potchefstroom. It's about 150 kilometers from Johannesburg, and it's a university town. I studied at the University of Pretoria, where I obtained my honours degree in Chartered Accountancy in 2006, and I then qualified as a Chartered Accountant in 2009 after completing my articles at KPMG. Following articles, I joined the KPMG technical department. And during that time, I also completed my master's degree in tax at the University of Pretoria. Currently, I'm an associate professor at the Northwest University, where I'm responsible for the master's program in tax. So on this program, I present the lectures on, amongst others, the tax considerations if we look at things like wealth planning, on corporate tax, international tax, and I also supervise tax research for the master's students. I've also been an independent South African tax and IFRS advisor since 2010, and I advise directly to companies, mostly medium to large companies, to high net worth individuals, and also to other advisors like auditors, accountants, and lawyers. So I think that's enough about me. Let's move on to the podcast itself. So where did I get this idea to do a podcast? So I've been listening to podcasts myself for several years on all kinds of topics, everything from AI to building a small business, training for marathons, and now also more recently on how to do your own podcast. And while listening to these other podcasts, the idea grew with me that as a professional and an academic, I might have something to share and give back to the South African tax community. So the main target of this podcast is South African tax practitioners and professionals who wish to stay up to date with South African tax. Important, the whole approach and the way that I present the content is aimed at persons having an education in tax and practicing tax day to day. So it might be that others also find it nice to listen to. So if you, for example, a taxpayer, there could be something in the podcast that's of interest to you. Just bear in mind that you do need the certain background knowledge about the South African tax legislation for the content of this podcast to really be valuable to you. And as I will also remind you in each episode, the idea is not to provide tax advice through the podcast. Format-wise, the podcast is a weekly podcast that deals with a topic or a recent development in the field of South African tax. The name Tax Break came from the idea that each episode must just be short enough to listen to while you need a break from work. So when you take your coffee break, this is something that should be that you should be able to listen to when and as you take that break. So it's not too technical, but the idea is still to share some critical information about the topic with you. If you would like to join me on this journey, there are a few places where you can get access to the podcast. Currently, the podcast is on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and if you would like to see me, there's a video version on my YouTube channel as well. So I've included the link to the channel in the show notes. Important is that the podcast is not really about me. It's about the South African tax community. So if you've got any ideas that you would like to share with me, suggestions for future episodes, topics you would like me to speak about, you're more than welcome to send me an email. My email address is also in the show notes. And then, of course, I would welcome your feedback, whether it's good feedback, bad feedback. This is also a new experience for me to record a podcast. And I'm recording it from my home office. My dog is lying here next to me. So there are definitely things I think that over time will change or that I would start to do differently as time goes on. I think that's about enough for an introduction. I hope that you are as excited about the podcast as I am and that you will join me on this journey by subscribing to the podcast. Until the first episode, goodbye.